Welcome to the Fierce Kind Mama of Multiples podcast. This podcast is for anyone expecting or currently raising multiples, twins, triplets, or more. I speak to inspiring parents of multiples who have healed from unexpected pregnancies and birthing experiences and who candidly share the highs and lows of raising multiples. I also speak to the professionals that work with multiple birth families. Together, we cover the practicalities of raising more than one baby at a time, as well as enhancing the emotional well-being of caregivers and children alike. Come join us as we laugh, cry, and share our personal and professional wisdom on all things multiples. I am your host, Dr. Christina Kvetsa, and I am a fierce kind mama of multiples. On today's episode, I'm joined by Dr. Katie Wood, an associate professor and clinical psychologist at Swinburne University of Technology in Australia. She has a long-standing research and clinical interest in twins and their families. For many years, she has provided seminars to numerous twin clubs in Victoria, Australia. In 2003, she was a member of the expert panel on the Channel 7 television program Twins, Australia's Most Identical. Katie is also a younger sibling of identical twin sisters, and so she brings both personal and professional insight into the psychology of twins. On today's episode, she provides some insight into the twin dynamic and offers advice to parents and twins themselves about how to navigate potential challenges unique to being a twin and to raising twins. I hope that you enjoy this episode. So I'd love to welcome on today's episode, Dr. Katie Wood. Welcome, Katie.
Well, thank you. Thanks for having me, Christina.
Yes, lovely to have you here. I'd love for you to speak a bit about your personal and professional experience and what got you interested in studying the psychology of twins.
Well, I guess from a personal perspective, I am a younger sibling of identical twins. So I have twin sisters. I guess growing up, I always sort of was struggling to sort of understand what was going on in my sister's relationship, and sort of grew up, there was just the three of us, but I really spent a long time of my childhood and youth sort of longing for my own twin. So I always felt that there was something sort of missing in my life, and I could see these two people just having this really unique and close relationship where they just shared all these experiences and just sort of got each other. I spent a fair bit of my time trying to divide and conquer them and sort of work out how I could get between them. And I realized that that was going to be not achievable. So I sort of thought, well, what's another way that I can understand this relationship and celebrate it rather than sort of resent it or want one of my own and not be able to have that. So I then decided to sort of start studying twins when I went to university, and I was very fortunate to meet at the time Professor David Hay, who was running the La Trobe University twin study. And so I started working with him, and through that work I really had the privilege of working closely with twin families from both a research perspective, but also part of the work that I was doing involved going into many homes of twins around Australia. So New South Wales, Western Australia and Victoria regionally. And I really got to sit down and hear from the families themselves. And that really opened up my eyes to what it meant to be growing up in a family with twins from the parents' perspective, from the sibling perspective, and from the twins themselves. I really then dedicated a large part of my career to working with twin families and supporting the community and understanding what it means to sort of be a twin and grow up in a family with twins.
Yeah, wow. What an amazing journey. Because I imagine when you were a child, you wouldn't necessarily have set out to embark on this professional journey of understanding twins and the dynamics in their families. But I also imagine that that experience of being a younger sibling to identical twins, maybe that was kind of the impetus, or, at least it gave you a unique position, doesn't it? A unique insight.
Yeah, I think so. And I think my personality is sort of when I don't understand something or it doesn't feel quite right or something, I like to understand it better and work out what this thing is. So I was really, I guess, committed to try to understand this relationship that twins experience, because I think it's one that we don't really fully understand, and even twins themselves struggle to articulate what it is that they share, including all that's good about being a twin, but also at times when it doesn't work out well, because not all twins get along, and not all twins share a close relationship. In my work, I guess after I finished studying, I then went into practice. A lot of my practice is working with twins and twin families across the lifespan. So very young twins, parents of twins, adult twins, twins that speak, twins that don't speak to their co-twin. And yeah, I work with a whole range of situations that impact multiple births. And I also find that in the field of psychology, there's not any specific training for psychologists to understand twin psychology. It's not necessarily typical for psychologists when they're having a client to ask if they're a multiple birth or if they're a member of a multiple birth family, which in my experience is a very significant factor to ask and to understand somebody's history.
Yeah, I think that that's a really important point. There's a couple of things actually you said that I want to touch on. You spoke about almost as if it's a myth that people have around twins, that they're always going to have a special close relationship. I wonder if you could speak about that in terms of, is that true? What are the factors there that affect whether twins get along?
Yeah, so I think there's a phenomena, sort of, we call it assimilation. So some twins work really hard to be the same, particularly identical twins, and other twins work really hard at not identifying with their co-twin. And that can be reinforced or influenced by factors in the environment. So some parents are very adamant that they're going to treat their twins as individuals. You know, there's a real push to be different, whereas other parents are less concerned about that. And other parents, again, committed to reinforcing sameness. So when my parents had my sisters, I guess historically the idea was that twins, you know, more emphasis was given to the sameness. It's not uncommon if you look back in pictures to see them dressed the same haircut, everything the same. So that reinforces, I guess, that part of the twin dynamic that we would call the us part, the togetherness. Whereas these days, parents are more inclined through education, I think, to sort of separate and try to create difference. We don't necessarily have to work at either extreme. I guess the challenge is to sort of find somewhere in the middle. So you can celebrate same and different simultaneously. But those experiences growing up may well shape just how close the twins are as they go through life. You know, some twins resent same and not having separate experiences, whereas other twins find that very comforting and want to nurture and protect that.
Yeah. I think that's a really good point. And it speaks to something I think I've experienced with my own twins. I have identical twin boys, and there's almost a level of anxiety when they're apart.
Mm-hmm.
And I've tried, obviously, knowing the importance of attachment and trying to give them that individual attention. But it's almost like they resist that. And at times it's been hard for me to know, do I push it? Do I try to force them to have time apart? I guess the approach that I've taken is to be guided by them and what they want and what they need. And I'm wondering if it changes over time. Like, my boys are still quite young, whether there is a critical period where some of this changes for twins, where they all of a sudden it's actually, I need to separate myself a bit from my twin.
Yeah, I think, you know, when you say that they may feel quite anxious about being apart, if you think about the co-twin as sort of being, they're each other's anchor to life. So they're sort of each other's reference point. And so to sort of take that away, you can sort of feel a bit at sea and a bit lost. And also, if one twin's doing something else, often the other twin will be wondering what they're doing and asking all sorts of questions. You know, what are they doing now? Or did they do that? And that can sort of speak to the competition between twins, which can either be spoken or unspoken. And so it's hard to sometimes tolerate being separate to your twin for fear of either betraying your twin or for fear of missing out, or that something's going to then come at the cost of the twinship, or something's going to sort of intrude between the twins. So it's safer sometimes for them to just stick together and protect that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. When you were speaking, it really resonated, I think, with what I notice in my boys, especially that kind of, it's almost that checking in all the time. I wonder what he's doing, or even just recently taking one to run some errands. When
Mhm.
we got home, the other one was like, "Where were you guys? What did you do? It took so long. Like you guys," and we weren't gone that long, Like in any other circumstance, they would have thought it was just a quick trip. But he was quite worked up, I guess, by the thought of us being away for whatever it was, 30 minutes to an hour, and really curious as to what did we do, and also upset actually that he didn't experience some of what we experienced, which was very benign. Like it wasn't anything important, but it was just, I guess, that idea of like, yeah, I missed out.
Yeah, and you also have to think that, and I'll get back to that idea of how that might change over time, but you also have to think that twins are sort of born into a social world, which is very different to how single born children come into the world. So single born children just come into the world and have exclusive access to their parents straight away, whereas twins are sharing space in utero, and then they come into the world having to share the social world with their parent, which is a very different experience to what single born children have. So, of course, when one twin gets access to you, the other twin sort of wants that too, because it's exclusive access to the parent. Some twins sort of get into a pattern where they have to sort of compete for that exclusive access to their parent because they're not used to having it. Because in the early period, after having twins in the postnatal period, it's so exhausting. You're trying to just navigate how to meet the needs of these two babies simultaneously. And if there's another child in the family, it can even be doubly exhausting. And so you're often cutting corners. You're trying to find ways of sort of getting them in sync or not in sync with their cycles. Oftentimes you're sort of responding to them together rather than separately, which reinforces, albeit not consciously, that togetherness. So they learn very quickly that they sort of have to fight for resources, fight for time, fight for space, fight for their primary attachment figures. And so that sort of can set a pattern of competition for that over time, which is right. It's really important for parents, as you did, to sort of carve out that time, but also explain to the co-twin, we're just going here and that's okay. You're going to be doing this while we're gone. And when we get back, we'll talk about what we've done. And then also to balance that and have out time with the other twin at a different time. But it doesn't have to
Yes.
be equal time.
Yes. I think that's an important point. I think there's sometimes this real push to try to recreate or make everything the same, like fairness. I've got to spend the exact amount of time with one child as I do with the other. We've got to do sort of similar activities. Otherwise, they'll be upset or it won't seem fair. So I think that's an important point, that it doesn't necessarily have to be exactly the same and equal. The other thing that I've noticed too, and I've heard you speak about this before, is the phenomenon of the so-called mother's twin versus father's twin, in that kind of dynamic, in that kind of family situation where there are two parents and twins. And I know from my own experience that this is something that as a family we experienced, where one of my boys became almost rejecting of me. He decided that his favorite person was his father. And it got to even to a point where we'd all be together. My partner would actually say, you're being rude. Stop being rude to mommy. Like, it was quite extreme. It's since changed. It's not like that anymore. But he aligned with my partner, and my other son showed a clear preference for me. And I remember at the time, I didn't really know how to handle it. I remember thinking, have I done something wrong? Like, am I doing something wrong? I tried not to take it personally, and I tried to kind of understand what was happening. But I wonder if you could speak to that experience that some multiple birth parents might have, and notice that one twin is clearly showing a preference for one parent, and the implications of that and how parents can navigate that.
Yeah, and there is some literature that sort of supports that phenomena. And it might be a preference that the twins show, and it might equally be a preference that the parents show. And that might be through practical reasons. You take this twin, it just happens that in this family, I always take this twin out, or you always are taking this twin to swimming while I take this twin to whatever the other activity might be. And that then reinforces this sort of unspoken preference. Or the parents might have an unspoken sense of, I find this twin easier to manage, so I'm naturally inclined to sort of do things with this twin. So sometimes these dynamics within a family, there's no malintent in it, and they're just more how the family sort of adapted to having the twins. And the twins themselves can equally, like in your case, at that moment in time, also show a preference, because it might be easier, for example, to get access to that parent at a particular point in time. So it's then how do parents sort of understand that, talk about it, and then sort of not reinforce it in a way that's not sort of healthy, that you can actually spend time with each of us together and each of us on our own, and that's okay. I mean, parents also of twins will often speak about, which is, again, it's really different to when you talk with parents of single-born children, that parents will often speak about this feeling of exclusion from the twin dynamic, which may also, I don't know any specific research on that, but it could reinforce this idea of having to preference self to one, because parents who say that they feel excluded from the twinship, and they almost feel like an intruder into this dynamic because the twins are actually regulating themselves together rather than having the parent regulate distress. They co-regulate because the twins can be quite self-sufficient together, and they're sharing all this sort of relationship that's quite intense and special. Parents can feel sort of outside of that, which can sort of create feelings of guilt, sort of jealousy. And again, that might promote that sort of preference sort of behavior. And particularly in twins, some twins will have, what we call cryptophasia, which is a secret language. So if twins are talking in their language that no one else understands, that also reinforces this togetherness with the parent sort of outside, which is quite a different experience to when you have a single-born child.
Absolutely, yeah. It's almost as if the parents are kind of trying to divide and conquer and, break the bond, if you like, not necessarily in any conscious way, but just trying to get in to develop some relationship.
Mm-hmm. And so when a younger sibling comes along in a family, parents will often say, oh, it was such a sort of refreshing experience to just have the one baby again, and the one baby just needing me, which is quite different when you've got two babies needing you simultaneously, but also giving the sense that they need each other more.
Yes, yeah.
So it's quite a fascinating dynamic to sort of think about in that way, and how that then shapes the twins' development over time.
Yes, yeah. Hi there, fierce kind mama. Are you expecting multiples and wondering how you're going to cope when the babies arrive? Or do you already have multiples at home and wonder, will this ever get easier? First of all, let me say loud and clear, I get it. Feeling overwhelmed in motherhood is really common, and us mothers of multiples are particularly prone to feeling sometimes like it's all too much. I know for myself that becoming a first-time mother to twins at the age of 40 was a huge adjustment, physically and psychologically. So I've taken my years of training in mental health and my experience coaching mothers of multiples and put together a guide with my 5 top tips for overcoming overwhelm as a multiple birth parent. This guide is free, of course, and it doesn't matter what age multiples you have. You may be pregnant, or your multiples might have already left home. The principles apply to all parents of multiples, and because I know you're short on time, I've broken down the tips into easy-to-read chunks that you can begin implementing straight away. You can get your free copy now by signing up at my website, fiercekindmama.com. And I know, we touched on a little bit of that twin dynamic and those parts. And I've heard you speak about this before. There's 3 parts, the me, the you, and the us. I wonder if you could elaborate on that a bit more. And also, I think the critical period in which twins find that they feel the need to want to separate from the co-twin.
Yeah, so I sort of think about the twin dynamic in those 3 parts. So the me being, who am I, separate to my co-twin? What do I bring to this relationship or this dynamic? And then the you, that's the co-twin. Who is the co-twin separate to me? And what do they bring? What's unique to them? And then the us part is the togetherness. What is it about us? And that really is the psychology of the twins lies in that us part. And that is what is it about us? What do we bring together? And how do we understand this dynamic or this relationship between us? And the challenge, I guess, for parents and educators and the twins themselves is how to get a balance between those 3 parts. So when the me is much bigger, then the co-twin can sort of feel betrayed or resentful or misunderstood, or indeed might be quite relieved. When the you is too big, the other twin can feel that. And I guess when the us is too big and it stretches out those me and you, then you're sort of at a risk of losing the individual parts that each twin brings to their relationship. It's trying to get that balance, those three parts in balance, so that they can celebrate what is unique to them as twins and the twinship, while simultaneously coming out of the twinship and knowing themselves separate to their twin. Who am I separate to you? How do I function in the world independent of you, while also simultaneously being able to share life with you, if that's what we do? So it's sort of, one's not mutually exclusive. So often twins might think that they have to be completely, and parents too, completely individual in order to navigate life. But I don't think they're mutually exclusive. I think you can celebrate who you are separate to your twin, while also celebrating this amazing experience in many ways for many twins, not all, but what is unique to the twinship. Because if you think about it, not in all cases, because not all twins navigate this easily, or in many cases, your co-twin is your buffer in life. It's your protective factor. And we spend life trying to find a protective factor. So you've got one ready-made right there. So when you go to school for the first time, you've got your buffer. When you're navigating big things in life, you've got your buffer. So how do we celebrate that and use it while also being able to make independent decisions?
Yeah, I love that. I love celebrating it, as you said. And I wonder, is there, in your research or in your experience, have you noticed whether there's a difference on what you've been talking about here with the three parts between identical and non-identical twin pairs? Or is it a similar phenomenon or experience?
It can be, but I think in identical twins, everything is a bit more exacerbated and intense because they're obviously genetic replica. The genes are coming into play too. So when you look at your identical twin, you are looking at yourself and you're seeing those parts of yourself that you may like or you may not like.
Yes.
And sometimes your co-twin is enacting those parts of self that you don't like on your behalf. And that's what I find fascinating in terms of unpacking the dynamic between identical twins, because often adults sort of get caught in stereotyping them or using language that sort of, oh, that's the smarter twin, or that's the more outgoing twin. And that's really unhelpful, and it's misrepresenting the twin dynamic, because it might be implicitly understood within the twinship that for as long as you go out and be outgoing, I can sit back and watch until it suits us for us to flip that. So you can be the assertive one and I'll just sit back and watch because you're doing it on behalf of both of us. Because I gain from you. I gain from you going out and doing that, and then we can flip if we need to.
Yes, right. That's fascinating. And I think, as my mind was going, I thought, as you were speaking, my mind was going to, I could see problems arising from that too, where, as an example, maybe one twin doesn't develop the skills, or is this a possibility? Maybe this is actually a question to pose to you. Is it a possibility that by letting one twin do, say, the going out and speaking and being the assertive one, the one that isn't doing that, is there sometimes problems then for the one that's not practicing those skills? And if that does happen, then how can we as parents prevent some of that?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think if that sort of pattern of behavior gets reinforced, then yes, it can sort of become a more, I guess that's an expectation of what happens, but it might not actually be an accurate representation of each twin. And I always come back to the idea, it's really important to give twins the opportunity to speak when they can and as they get older about what it's like for them to be a twin. And many of the adult twins that I work with now would reflect on sort of when they think back to their life growing up, they sort of say, I wish I had an opportunity to speak about some of these experiences and how they impacted me and how they impacted us. And if people sort of knew that back then, maybe they would have made different decisions about, what we needed. And oftentimes it's adult twins reflect back and say people, including parents, assumed we needed and wanted the same. And sometimes we did, and sometimes we didn't. So giving them the opportunity to sort of express and create, I guess, a narrative about what it means to be a twin.
Yes.
And the things that they really like about it and the things that they sort of find challenging and difficulty and they're not sure how to speak it. So, for example, how do you celebrate the success of your twin when you want the success yourself, but you didn't get it?
Yeah, that would be a big one, I imagine. What is your recommendation there to how do you deal with that?
Well, I think part of that is to know, right from early parenting, what we were saying before, that things don't have to be equal. Sometimes you're going to get something that your co-twin doesn't, and that's going to have to feel whatever it feels, disappointment, resentful, jealous, envy. And then how do we support you to come to acceptance? Because that's going to be life. Sometimes you'll get and sometimes you won't get the same. And also then educating others to not reinforce all the time sameness, or that they can't cope if something happens to one and not the other. So sometimes in school environments, for example, kids won't vote for twins to be in leadership roles because they don't think they can cope if one twin gets it and the other doesn't. So they just miss out, both of them.
Oh, wow. Yeah, okay.
So the one doesn't get invited to a party. And what about if the other does? Well, sometimes parents just don't invite twins because they don't know how to navigate that.
Yes.
Or the child says, I only want Jack to come, but I'm not friends with John. But the parent doesn't know how to navigate that, so neither of them get an invite.
Yes. And I think that is such a sad situation that can happen when it's something that's preventable, but the adults really are struggling with how to deal with the twinship, really, and how to navigate those tricky situations.
Some parents might feel upset about that and then not sure how to navigate that with the twin that misses out. But I always say to parents, it's okay. They'll manage that. This is good practice because sometimes they will miss out and they have to learn how to sort of reconcile that.
Yes. And I think it's such an important life skill. Like when I think about the work that I do, as in my experience as a psychologist, in my experience in coaching parents of multiples, one of the most important skills that I think anyone, not even just a parent, anyone can have is learning how to tolerate discomfort. That's such an important life skill.
Yeah, and I think parents can support the twin in those situations and the twin that gets invited, mind you, because they often feel guilty and not sure that they should go, how to sort of navigate that together. I see that a lot as well when one twin, and we were talking before about those transition points, can be tricky to get that balance. And the other main one is during adolescence. And if you think about the developmental task of adolescence, it's sort of separating and individuating from your parent and navigating the world with peers. And for adolescent twins, particularly identical twins, they sort of have to work out, how do I separate from my parents and simultaneously my co-twin? So they've sort of got a double developmental task, if you like. And at that time, when I see adolescent twins, often there's this sort of tension between, I want to have this group of friends, or I want to do things differently or branch out, but I feel guilty that I'm leaving my twin. And I feel like I'm betraying the twinship. And I don't know how to reconcile that. So if I'm not going to reconcile it, then we're just going to stay together and do everything together. And what happens then is, if you transition to high school, all the other kids see you two together and they're not sure what to do. So they'll often just leave the twins and not know how to sort of come in and break that up or what to do. So they won't necessarily do anything.
Yeah, they're treating them like a unit and not really seeing them as the individuals that they are.
Mm-hmm. Also, if one twin then forms a relationship outside the twinship, so partners, it can also be a tricky time because the twin that partners can feel guilty that they've left behind the twin. They're trying to replicate the experience they've had with their co-twin in their new relationship, which isn't going to be the same. And then the co-twin feels betrayed and abandoned. And then this twin that's partnered feels guilty. And so that can sort of also create a whole lot of tension that might see them coming in for some support around that.
Yeah. And, when you were speaking, I thought, wow, what a challenge. Because, adolescence, just for anyone, is a tricky period of development. There's lots of changes. And to then have this almost additional layer of complexity around finding your individual self from your parents, but now also from your co-twin. Then what if there's relationships, wanting to have a romantic relationship, and all of the problems that can arise, or not necessarily problems, but the negative feelings and the discomfort that can arise from wanting a romantic relationship, but also not wanting to break the bond you might have with your co-twin. So I wonder, what can we as parents do? I'm sure there'll be some listeners who do have adolescent twins. What are some of the tips you would give them to how to navigate this period?
I mean, sometimes the parents will feel quite caught in the middle, literally, because the twins in that time will sort of come to the parent with each of their grievances about the co-twin.
Oh, okay.
And so the parents will say, I feel caught in the middle. I'm not sure how to manage these alliances. And so part of my role is also supporting parents to sort of stay neutral and listen as they would with any children around sibling sort of grievances, but to give a balanced view, but to make it clear to the twins that they're open to both of them.
Okay, so not showing preference.
Yeah, and encouraging them to talk about what's going on together. So sometimes I'll work with the twins together at that time, invariably, to give them a space, and sometimes with the parent present as well, so they can be privy to the conversation, to what's actually going on here, and starting to name the feelings. So you're actually telling me, it sounds like, that you're feeling abandoned by your twin, and you've gone through life doing everything together up until this point. And so there's also grief and loss around what it means to sort of experience this change in the dynamic. And so many twins will sort of resonate with that word. Yes, it feels like some part of me has gone missing. There's this real deep grief when one twin partners and the other doesn't. And as I come back to that idea, if you've sort of lost your anchor, so you're sort of a bit at sea, you don't know where to anchor yourself now, and you're not sure what this means for the dynamic, because you shared everything together and now your twin is sharing these things with someone else. And it feels and sounds and experience is now different. It doesn't mean that you can't manage this or navigate it. It's just a different part of the transition, or, I guess, evolution of the twinship.
Yeah, that's the word I was thinking.
Yeah. Well, some twins find it very difficult to evolve in that way, which is why some relationships outside the twinship do not work, and some twins decide not to have relationships outside the twinship.
Yeah, right. Okay. Because of the distress, because of these feelings that they just can't seem to tolerate.
Yeah, or not needing to, preference to not. It's very individual. Some twins who do partner, like in my sister's case, the partners get along really well, and sort of have to, because the partners have to understand that they're not going to trump, in many cases, not in all, the twinship. So the twinship is still going to be a relationship that's unique and different to what they have with each of the twins. The challenge for twins as well is, which is why sometimes they find intimate relationships, not all twins, but can be challenging, or friendships, is because if you've had this experience growing up with someone always there who you don't even have to explain things to, they just get you. They get what you're feeling and thinking often. And again, this is not all twins, but often you're sort of searching life to replicate that experience in other relationships, or to play out the dynamic that you had with your twin in other relationships, but it's not the same. So, they often feel that something's missing in those other relationships, which is why sometimes they don't sort of endure over time.
Oh, yes. Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Absolutely. And so I can see that all of this is just really challenging, I imagine, for twins who are still kind of learning and evolving themselves, and then having to recognize and accept that their relationship will evolve and change, that there'll be maybe other people coming into the picture, whether it's friendships or romantic relationships, but how that evolves and changes the twinship relationship as well. Also, I think it's almost as if there's a mindset shift that needs to happen in terms of, I could see problems arising if the twins or one of the twins experiences it as a loss rather than a gain. Mm-hmm. So that this other relationship that has come in, whether it's a friendship or a romantic relationship, if we view it as, it means now I have lost something, I've lost my co-twin, versus, oh, actually I'm gaining something I'm gaining a friend in the family or an addition to the family, that kind of idea. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that's what
Yeah.
is important, to sort of give it a different lens. I also think it's about shifting expectation within the twinship. So what does it like for you to know that your twin is sharing things with someone else when, it may have just been you? And if you're trying to carve out, life separate to your twin with someone else, and your twin's still relying on you and not shifting in those expectations, how do we support the co-twin to do that? Because things are no longer the same or what they used to be. And I think if, there's an open dialogue about that, then it's much easier to sort of navigate and understand it, because twins often just feel it, but they're not necessarily processing what it means in the context of the relationship and where they've come from right from conception, where they've, as I was saying before, sort of born into this social world with someone right from conception. And then to have a transition where that someone is no longer there makes sense that you would feel grief. You might feel relief as well, but it's just giving space to that experience, I think.
Yeah, I think that's a really key point. The ability to communicate and be aware of how you're feeling and what that's bringing up in the relationship, but being able to communicate, I guess, with your coach. I think that's what I'm hearing from you is really important. And not just between the twins, but the family, the larger family, having some of these things openly communicated sounds like that would be a really good starting point. Trying to ignore or somehow do things in secret to try to make things better, but actually being just really upfront about what are we feeling? What are we experiencing? How can we as a family navigate this together? Maybe it's a mindset shift that needs to happen. Maybe it's we actually need to behave differently towards each other, whatever it is. But being able to communicate that as a family openly.
Yeah. Yeah. And what does it mean to make a different choice? It doesn't mean that you're no longer celebrating the twinship. It just means that in this point in time, you have a different preference or a different choice that you want to make or a different pathway that you want to go down. And how do you sort of support each other in those choices? And that can be sort of a lifelong challenge, particularly if there've been very significant competition between the twins. It's sort of been reinforced through their earlier years. And that can be quite intolerable at times, for twins to sort of have to be seen to be better than or not able to sort of manage when things aren't the same.
Yeah.
So we see that a lot, in identical twins who sort of work really hard to keep the status quo because the alternate is anxiety provoking.
Yes, right. So feeling like they're different actually creates anxiety.
Yeah. Or that the twins got something that I haven't and I have to work hard at getting it too, because then it reestablishes equilibrium. And equilibrium or the status quo feels safer than an alternate.
Yes. So is it about then buffering or, providing, I guess, implementing or strengthening the coping strategies of the child, the twin that hasn't got the same thing or hasn't received what it is that the other twin has?
Yeah. And again, just coming back to that language of it's okay, sometimes you're going to get things and sometimes you're not. And also supporting educators to manage that too, in the school system, and educating the broader school community around that it's okay if one twin gets this and the other doesn't, and educating parents of other children that, you can invite them without the other. It's okay.
Yes.
We handle it as a family. You don't need to invite both, but you can as well. You can invite both as well.
Yeah.
I mean, logistically for families of twins, it becomes hard to always create difference because it's very time and labor intensive. So I would never say to a family, you have to do everything different activities, different schedules, because that's not realistic for a family of twins where it's very busy. So it makes sense by virtue of being a twin as well that you would have similar interests. You both might like swimming or music and so it's okay to do the same. But in the school setting, you might, for example, when they're just transitioning to school and they're in the same class, and it's a whole nother topic, but you might have different days for show and tell. You have them seated on different tables, different maths groups or literacy groups. So they're getting used to being in the same geographical space, same classroom, but participating in the classroom in different activities at different times. So
Yeah,
you're
yeah. I think that,
reinforcing, you've got the buffer still there, but you're also reinforcing that, you can actually be part and function well.
yes, yes. I think that's a really important point and great advice there around how we can actually do that, how we can implement some separateness while still being in the same classroom or being in the same environment. So I am conscious of time, and I know we could talk more and more because I know you have a lot of personal and professional wisdom on this topic that you could share with us. But I wonder if we could just end, I'd love to hear, I guess, around your own experiences as being a younger sibling to identical twins. Because I imagine there's some people in the audience, people listening to this who may be expecting multiples and they have a singleton or maybe even more than one singleton. And they might be a bit worried about bringing in these new additions to the family and what that means for the other siblings. I wonder if you could just briefly talk about what advice you'd give to those families.
Yeah, I think we know now, early research was painting a picture for the older sibling of twins that illustrated that some older siblings found their birth and arrival of twins, just as any older sibling does when a new baby comes along or can, that can be experienced as quite a significant displacement. So all the attention has been on the older child, the firstborn, and then all of a sudden these two babies come along and the general community is fascinated with the twins and interested because twins are fascinating to the general community. So all of a sudden this older sibling that's been sort of here is then sort of dethroned. And some of the research sort of suggests that those twins can act that out, the older sibling can act that out, maybe regress. That does happen in the general, older sibling sort of literature. And some might act it in and so show some internal distress or some worries about what it means. I think, though, in the area, what mitigates that is, and families are great at doing this, many families, do this incredibly well, is just sort of preparing the older sibling for that arrival. So speaking about it, what's going to happen, preparing them, including them. And in the case of multiple birth families or families that are expecting twins, just linking in with twin clubs in your local area is a great way to get resourced, and it's a great way to support the older siblings. And the twin clubs do a wonderful job at sort of navigating those transitions. And those older siblings that are prepared, know what's happening, feel included, usually adjust pretty well. But it is in early preparation and bringing in supports to the family, if that's possible, a network of support so that there isn't, the older sibling sort of feels held in that experience, because of course parents' time is going to be naturally depleted when the twins first arrive, and that might be complicated if there are complications in the twin pregnancy. So it is around just sort of keeping that communication open, using language that the older sibling can understand, and also, as hard as this is, carving out time for the older sibling. So I also talk about, with families generally around, what sort of rituals do you have? What rituals can you create for the older sibling and for the family around those transitions? Writing the older sibling a letter that they're ready for when you go into hospital, having that letter there with something, maybe a special teddy or something that's just theirs, so they feel held in mind. Having a ritual for when the babies come home that the older sibling has, like a book. They get to share special time with either parent. And also for parents to know that it really is about just having moments with the child. So it doesn't have to be hours. It can just be moments of special time that get carved out. And so when the twins are in sync in their sleep cycle, which may be quite challenging, and it's hard because at that time, usually the parent wants to sleep, but is it possible to sort of carve out time for the older sibling? If there are grandparents, relying on family, extended family. So I'm really big on sort of using language to express what's happening, to talk about that, to validate any feelings that the older sibling might have, to notice what might be different, and to be able to express that in a way that does validate the experience of that child. But the experience might change over time.
Yes, yes. I'm loving that. And I think maybe that is a bit of the take-home message from today's episode is in terms of relationships with either the multiples, the parents' relationships with each twin or the other children, the singletons in the family, is quality over quantity. And that seems to be a really important message, I think, that we can take, that we don't need to necessarily have hours and hours of time with each child individually. But if we can find those micro moments of connection, presence, then naturally everyone's just going to feel more belonged and loved for. So thank you so much, Katie, for today, for your sharing your wisdom with us and your experience. I have really enjoyed this conversation, and I'm sure that the listeners will have a lot to take away from it. I'd love to have you back on if we have time and you have time, but it's been such a pleasure connecting with you today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Christine. It's been a pleasure too, and thank you for the invitation.
Thank you. Thanks for listening to today's episode. If you like what you've heard, then please consider subscribing and leaving a review so that other expectant and current parents of multiples like yourself can find this podcast and the valuable information it contains. I would be so very grateful if you left a review and shared this with anyone you think could benefit from listening. If you have a particular topic you'd like me to cover on this podcast, feel free to reach out to me via my website, fiercekindmama.com, or connect with me on social media. I'm on Instagram and Facebook as Fierce Kind Mama of Multiples. New episodes are released every fortnight, so we'll see you back here real soon. Any advice and information in this podcast is general only and has been prepared without taking into account your particular circumstances and needs. For tailored, individualized advice, please consult with a qualified professional.